Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, Ad Nauseam listeners, to episode 156. My name is Dr. David C. Noe. I'm here in the Vomitorium South. That would be the basement of the RHB bookstore and coffee shop. And I'm with my good friend and fabulous co-host, Dr. Jeffrey T. as in what? Terrific?
Terrific. I'll take it. Yeah,
Jeffrey Terrific Winkle.
Yes.
How are you, Jeff?
I'm feeling good. I'm back from a week's vacation up in the beautiful woods of northern Michigan.
Were you actually in the woods, or were you mostly sitting in a lawn chair on a dock, something like that?
We were woods adjacent.
Okay.
It was mostly on the beach, on the shores of Lake Michigan. It was great. It was wonderful. But it's good to be back down in the Vomitorium.
Is that near Michigumi?
Michigumi? I'm not sure where Michigumi is.
Is the song by Gordon Lightfoot?
It's Gitchagumi, isn't it?
Gitchagumi,
Right.
Sorry. The Edmund Fitzgerald?
Right, we weren't that far north. Gitchagumi, that's the word for Lake Superior.
Is that
right?
Lake Superior?
Yeah,
So
it is, yeah.
Gitchagumi is Lake Superior?
I believe so.
So what is Lake Michigan?
I don't know what it is. Isn't Michigan its
Maybe
native
it's
name?
Michigan?
It could be. Right.
So you're on vacation.
Yeah.
You're back. You're in fine fettle.
I am. I think so. How are you feeling?
I'm doing well, actually. Thank you.
Yes.
It's been a great week of nice temperatures. Got a lot of exercise in this week, which always makes me feel good.
Excellent.
And I've been eating well, sleeping fairly well, and quite productive.
All good. Checking all the boxes.
That's correct.
Yes. So I had to mention from vacation is one of the things that I do on this kind of large extended family vacation. I do all the cooking.
That's what I remember.
Right. And so I like to start the week with a pizza, like a specialty pizza. But my brother-in-law who comes in, he's also a specialty pizza maker, and so we disagree.
This would be Beck's brother.
We disagree on kind of the process, and so I was making this Chicago style pizza, and I was putting these slices of mozzarella on there. And he goes, dude, you got to shred it.
Okay.
It tastes much better. I said, come on, that doesn't make any difference. He goes, trust me, it makes a difference. So I shredded my own mozzarella, and I have to say he was right.
Okay.
So I went on this big kick, right?
Okay.
And if you buy the block of cheese and you shred it, it makes everything better. So I'm taking it to the masses, and I'm calling it "Make America Great Again." So look how I kept that short. I'm trying to keep it short.
Man, make them great again.
Again. Exactly right.
You know, my fear, Jeff, even as you were developing this, can I share my fears for just a moment?
Yeah.
My fear that this was going to be is that this was going to be some classic rock deep cut.
Oh.
And there would be lyrics that I didn't know.
Yeah.
From, I don't know, Pink Floyd or
one of these bands that you just dismiss out of hand.
Well, I just don't know them.
Gotcha.
Fleetwood Mac.
Yeah.
And you would have worked really hard on this and to be very clever, and then I wouldn't get it. And I'd have that deer in the headlights look that I have so often. You know, people tell me jokes.
Yeah.
And if I don't get it, I'm just not socially capable of laughing.
Yeah.
If I don't, you know this.
That's one of the things I really like about you, Dave.
Really?
I do.
I don't know how to laugh if I don't find it funny.
Yes. Right.
And I feel like it's a social failing, but other people are deeply hurt.
Yeah, exactly.
I've had people say to me, "Oh, so only you can be funny? Only you can tell?" No, it's just I don't get it, so I don't know what to do.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm glad it wasn't.
I'm glad
one of those.
I
things.
didn't lead you down that road.
Exactly. Make America great again. But talk some more about how that's one of the things you like about me.
Can we?
No,
I don't have enough time to talk about many things I like about you, Dave. What are we doing today?
Well, we're starting out without any corregenda, actually.
Oh, really?
Isn't that nice for a change?
Yeah, that feels good.
And we're starting out without any shout outs.
Yeah, that's not so good.
Well, yeah. But we do have actually a little bit of a promo here.
We do.
Yeah, I have in my laptop bag, I have 2 copies of Scott Van Zen's instrumental guitar offering, and I'm going to give them away. They are signed copies.
Fantastic.
So the name of the album is No Words, and it features, I think, 11 tracks. The first one of which is Goes to 11.
Nice.
You get it?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you listener would like to hear some of Scott's music, I think people still listen to CDs. I mean, it's signed. Send us an email and say, hey, I would like that free CD. Please send it to me with an Ad Nauseam sticker.
Yeah.
And Depending on who responds, we'll have a little drawing and we'll send those out, and you can enjoy his awesome guitar playing.
That'd be great. Maybe someday Scott could send us his works on vinyl.
That'd
I heard
be
about
great.
vinyl's making a big comeback.
Oh, vinyl is
People are
making a
collecting
huge,
again. Yeah,
a huge comeback.
That'd be great.
When I think of vinyl, all I can think of is Hot Car Seat from the late 70s.
Exactly.
I don't want to sit on that.
Dreading stepping into that
Exactly.
car. Right.
People today don't know what that's like, but we remember we were kids.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are we talking about today?
Today we have on the show our good friend and former guest.
Yes.
One Patrick M. Owens, the great spoken Latin guru,
Yeah.
classicist extraordinaire. He longtime listeners might remember he was on a two-parter talking
Yes.
about what the best Latin textbook is.
Yes, and what did the critics say about that? I think we have a little bit of a recording here. Mishka, can you play that clip of what the critics thought?
Worst episode ever.
Oh, not even close.
So what do you say, Jeff?
What are you talking about? It was great.
Okay.
All right, yeah.
So without further ado, let's welcome Patrick to the program. Welcome to the show, Patrick. We're so glad to have you back.
It's terrific to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, this is not the first time that Patrick has been on the show.
That's
right?
correct.
He was back with us. It's been a while.
It's been quite a while.
It was a two-parter talking about what's the best Latin textbook.
That's
I
correct.
believe. Yes.
Things got a little bit tense at one point, and I heard some feedback that they really liked the full-on nerd conflict between Dr. Owens, the revered Dr. Owens, and myself.
Yes.
So we're going to mostly avoid that today, I think. But before we get into the meat of today's episode, Patrick, can you tell us how have you been lately? What's going on in your part of the Latin world?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks for asking. Let's see. Things in my part of the Latin world are always exciting because Latin offers us an endless possibilities of things to study and discuss. The plethora of authors and topics. So my scholarship, my study continues and propels me forward.
Great. And today we're going to talk about an article that you wrote in 2016, which, believe it or not, is 8 years ago. And the title of that article is Barbarisms at the Gate of Some Perils in Active Latin Pedagogy. So this was published in the journal Classical World, Volume 109, number 4, the summer of 2016. And so let's jump right into it, Jeff. And why don't you lead off with the opening question for our esteemed guest, Dr. Owens?
Yeah, I'm actually going to start with a question that I actually want you to answer, I think, later, Patrick, because I am very curious to kind of hear what you would say about your view of things now 8 years on. And, what has changed, not in terms of, have you changed your argument, but what your view of kind of the state of Latin, the state of Neo-Latin today. But I think let's save that for the end. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what was the impetus for you writing this article? What were some of the issues that you saw that you wanted to put pen to paper here and get the word out?
And should we stipulate, Jeff, that his responses need to be on the whole in English rather than in spoken Latin?
Please, yes.
Because although I could probably interpret on the fly, I would no doubt make mistakes numerous. So for the sake of our listeners, he should speak English.
All right. So what motivated me? That's a great question. I think I wanted to share my reflections on the topic. Now, that may sound obvious to some of your audience members, but in academia, where the mantra goes publish or perish, that sort of motive, namely just sharing one's reaction or one's reflections on a topic, is, I think, less common than we'd hope. I also thought that I had a contribution to make. I thought that the Latin-speaking community, in part or in whole, might benefit from some retrospection.
So you have been a practitioner of active Latin since the early 2000s, is that correct? I mean, we talked about this a little bit on those other episodes, but it might be helpful to refresh the memory of our audience if they haven't listened to those.
Yeah, that's right. It's hard to pinpoint a time when one becomes a practitioner of spoken Latin unless one can look back at an event like a rusticatio or a conventiculum or something of that sort and say that's when they began. I was fortunate to attend a Jesuit preparatory school in New York City where all students were required to study Latin. And that started for me an exciting lifelong journey of learning and teaching the classical languages. I went on shortly thereafter to study with famed Father Reginald Foster over a few years. Subsequently took a degree in classics from Fordham University, and then moved to Italy to join a small cohort of scholars who were, I guess, the nascent Academia Vivarium Novum before it became a flourishing, internationally known institution. So from, say, beginning Latin in secondary school, I had opportunities to hear a high school teacher greet us in Latin or dismiss the class in Latin. And that always interested me. I always thought that the students in the modern languages had a foot up on us, that they were really engaged in the languages in a way that we in Latin and in the Greek classrooms were not. And so when I had the opportunity to study with Father Reginald Foster, who was a very proficient and a proponent of spoken Latin, that really changed things for me. And I realized how little Latin I knew and how much Latin there was to learn, which was an incredibly exciting prospect. Then I completed a master's degree at the University of Kentucky under the direction of Terence Thunberg, who himself is a practitioner and a well-known active Latin expert. And my PhD was at the Institutum Altiores Latinitatis in Rome, which is perhaps the only place in the world where at the time all the courses could be taught in Latin. I could take all of my exams and my comps in Latin. And then I wrote under Luigi Miraglia, who is also a proponent and an expert in Renaissance Latin and Humanist Latin. So it's hard for me to look back and say at one point I began my journey of speaking Latin. Certainly my time with Father Reginald Foster and my time with Terence Thunberg were incredibly formative. I'll go on to add that I had the good fortune of meeting the love of my life at a conventiculum under the aegis of the University of Kentucky. And she is also an accomplished Latinist. We raised 2 children together in the Wild West of Lander, Wyoming, where I was teaching at subsequently I taught at a small liberal arts college. And so I was able to have a home life that was also in Latin, a home life where much of daily chores and my relationship with my children were really in Latin. And so that fortified these previous experiences that I had.
Did you seek out to study with Foster because of his known facility in active Latin, or was it while you were studying with him that you said, "Oh, okay, this is exciting. This might be a better way to go with kind of learning and studying and teaching the language"?
Yeah, that's right. Those two things went hand in hand. Father Reginald Foster had an aura about him and a fame that made him seem gargantuan, made him larger than life. So I don't know that I went to study with him because he was such a proficient Latin speaker or because he was such a famous Latinist. I don't think I distinguished between the two of them. I wanted this experience of studying with the Latinist to the stars, the Pope's Latinist and the author of thousands of documents, and that he would speak Latin to us for a few hours every day was icing on the cake.
Yeah.
So thank you. So as we get into the article itself, I want to begin by reading a little portion from the first page and to get a bit of your response to it, Patrick, because this struck me particularly. You say, quote, "We are approaching a crucial tipping point wherein the first generation of students educated during the major revival of active Latin pedagogy are approaching leadership roles. These practitioners of active Latin are not only evangelizing their peers, but are also teaching ever more students to regard Latin as an actual language capable of meaningful communication, in which they can ultimately think without the need for an intermediary language of translation. Although the active Latin movement has grown exponentially, the success of the trend is hampered by both an unwillingness on the part of some entrenched readers and teachers and administrators, and the ire of critics, who charge that this is a futile exercise which does not approximate the Latin a student is likely to encounter in texts. End quote. Can you unpack some of those claims a little bit and explain it in a way that might be really approachable for us and our listeners?
I think my goal for the article was threefold. I hoped first to set out a history of active Latin pedagogy, especially in the US. I identified three general categories of missteps or errors in active Latin pedagogy. And I hope to suggest certain recommendations for amelioration or general improvements in both the practice of speaking Latin and the engagement of active Latin in the classroom. When I was writing this, which I really began probably in 2014, I did not yet see any institutions that had either professors or tenured instructors or even head teachers in the secondary school systems who had come up through active Latin pedagogy or who were even steeped in the movement. There were a couple of people who had written widely on active Latin or had written widely on Latin pedagogy in general, but they were few and far between. So I thought that at that period we were looking at the rise of a new cohort, a new normal within classical language pedagogy, especially in the US, wherein a plurality of up-and-coming instructors would have had some experience speaking Latin. They would have done a biduum. They would have done a week-long intensive in Spokane or in Los Angeles or in Kentucky. I anticipated that would bring about a real shift in the way that Latin instruction took place. Obviously, I mean shifting away from the grammar translation method of identifying cases and numbers, tenses and persons, to what I might call a more holistic or conversational approach. And the time right before a tipping point is a crisis point, right? And so
Sure.
there's always pushback, and that is partially what I was responding to in the history of active Latin pedagogy, in that although this movement had already been in place dating back to the mid 1990s, the entrenched professorial class and the old guard more frequently than not spoke disparagingly about it. And I thought that was probably either coming to an end or was about to be corrected by the growing number of active Latin practitioners going into the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very helpful. The next part of the article leads with this as the beginning of the paragraph, still pretty early on. And for the listeners, if they want to read the article, which I think is fascinating, some may find it a little bit dense at places, no more dense than I have found its author, but we can make that available to people. It begins, the term living Latin is itself misleading. So Patrick, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about why you find that term misleading and what might be a better way to describe this movement of active Latin pedagogy.
Oh, sure. So when we talk about active Latin pedagogy, I prefer that term generally to spoken Latin or to living Latin, because Latin, from a linguistic description, is a dead language. It is not a language that is typically spoken from birth, or it's not a native language to any community of speakers. And of course, there are outlier individuals who may grow up in a Latin-speaking home, but far and wide we can say that there's no cohesive community of Latin speakers. Latin doesn't change. It doesn't admit grammatical constructions that are novel. It doesn't admit new etymologies, or is, in a sense, it's a non-productive language. And there are exceptions to that statement, of course, as well. There are plenty of neologisms that Latin adopts from time to time to talk about the modern world, to talk about experiences that are qualitatively different from those of ancient Romans or medieval Latin speakers or Renaissance Latin speakers. But really, those are conservative additions, and they don't change the language in a fundamental way. And so it's I think, proper to say that Latin is a dead language. That doesn't mean that Latin can't be used as a mode of communication. It doesn't mean that Latin can't be the language of a particular community, or a lingua franca for a given community or event. But we don't want to be disingenuous. Latin is dead, and that's fine. Latin is sort of fossilized. It's immortalized. In a certain sense, there's been an apotheosis of Latin. Latin is now something that is a golden standard that we can look back on, from Cicero, who really functions as the touchstone of Latin syntax and grammar and diction. And we can say, okay, from the classical period, really Latin is set in stone. There are minute additions of grammatical constructions, few and far between in the early medieval period, that are adopted almost unanimously, and there's some vocabulary that's added, but really it is what it is. It's spoken for. Now, it's difficult for some people to hold that in mind and say, okay, it's a dead language, but people speak it. I thought, someone may interject, I thought that the difference between a living language and a dead language was that nobody speaks it. And that's easily understood, because that is what we experience when we talk about dead languages more frequently than not. But Latin is spoken. It's just not spoken by a natural community, and therefore the language doesn't develop in the same way as other languages do. Yeah, does that answer part of your question?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah, that's great. And related to that, one of the things I found really interesting in your article was you talk about, when you talk about like the fossilization or the immutability of Latin, and how it, it's kind of set in stone and doesn't, in many ways, it doesn't change. And so I think a question that I thought, it was somebody outside of the camp of the classical languages would ask is, okay, well, how can that possibly be? That you talk about how studying active Latin or using active Latin, you don't really have to deal with the issues of dialect because of its immutability. And so this language that was spoken and written over hundreds and hundreds of years, as the Roman Empire grew and developed other cultures within its borders, and you make the point that someone who can if you learn Ciceronian Latin, you can go on to read Juvenal, you can read Apuleius, you can read these authors writing in Latin from many different parts around the Mediterranean. I mean, a question that somebody might see is like, how did that even happen? How can a language that's spread, over chronology and geography be immutable to the point that you can kind of you can read it, you can kind of speak it in a way that would touch all of these different points along the way? I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, speak to how Latin is spoken in such a variety of places.
And could just talk about how its immutability, right? The fact, the question that struck me is like, how is it this language that was spoken over such a long period of time and across cultures doesn't change?
It's primarily because there is a division in Latin. There's the vulgar Latin and the literary Latin. Mm-hmm. Vulgar Latin is the lingua franca of the marketplace. Literary Latin is the lingua franca of the literati, of learned professionals,
yes,
of the clerici, the clergy, the ambassadors. And so this division allows vulgar Latin to continue to develop in its diverse regions, the Neo-Latin languages, that is the Romance languages, mm-hmm. while at the same time this stratification of language permits the literary Latin to continue as a literary language almost unencumbered by vulgar Latin and in a certain sense pure from the evolution and the addition, the creation of regional dialects, because the audience, generally speaking, of the literary tongue, of the what we'll end up calling classical or classicizing Latin, mm-hmm. that audience is not a region-specific audience. And so by the nature of the needs of literary Latin, namely to reach people in other areas, to function as the language of ambassadors, of kings and princes, of law courts that oversaw more than a specific region, it had to maintain a universality. And the only way that it does that is to hold itself to the standards of classical Latin. Mm. And very early on, by Quintilian, really, the hallmark, or as I said, the touchstone of Latin syntax and vocabulary is Cicero himself.
If I could just interrupt for a second, for the sake of the listeners, Quintilian, we're speaking of an individual at the end of the first century AD, right? Approximately.
Thank you.
60 AD to 120, somewhere in that range, contemporary of Tacitus and so forth.
So very soon after Cicero does his dialect, his particular use of the Latin language become the universally understood language that is Latin. Other things continued to be used in Europe that were called Latin. So the language that was spoken in marketplaces would not infrequently be referred to as Latin, even though it had diverged quite a bit from the standards of literary Latin. And so there wasn't always a recognition on the part of speakers that there were two totally distinct dialects until really the Carolingian Renaissance, wherein the Latin of the Church Fathers and of the classical authors was made the standard of the empire.
And when we say that, we're speaking of Charlemagne, 800 AD, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. That's really very helpful. And so from this non-literary Latin that was spoken all over the Italian peninsula and throughout Europe, eventually what we call the Romance languages, the younger, uglier sisters of Latin, that's where they came from, right? But literary Latin continued on unchanged. So for those who are really good at speaking French and Spanish and Portuguese and Italian, I apologize for my gratuitous swipe. Right. But I want to try out a little idea with both you and Jeff for a second, and then we can get back to the main point. It occurs to me that another kind of language might be a good analogy here for the deadness, and that would be the language of numbers, right? So if you're going to do, very simple equations, 12 plus 4 equals 16, right? A long time ago, those numbers were fixed and they've never really changed. Now, the study of mathematics has expanded into areas that the ancients didn't understand. So that's what I think from my limited knowledge. But the tools with which those investigations are made stayed fixed in that specific language of the abstraction of numbers, right? Nobody's inventing new ways to discuss these things. They're using given tools. And is this at all helpful? No one expects, for example, the language of numbers to have changed just because thousands of years have passed. Yeah. The language of Latin hasn't changed either because there's a fixed canon, and that has, I suppose, strengths and weaknesses alike, but we're concentrating on the strengths.
Yeah, I like that analogy a lot. What do you think about that, Patrick? Does that kind of dovetail with what you were just saying?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've never thought about numbers being fixed in that way, but certainly it dovetails perfectly insofar as the semantics of particular words, the constructions of sentences, how words are inflected, whether they be conjugated or declined. All those things were fixed at a relatively early point in the language's history. And when I say an early point in the language's history, we really mean 300 years into the literary history of the language, a history in total that is now more than 2,300 years old. So in the first, not just 25%, but very early on, for the entirety of the language was the fossilization or the fixture made, looking back to which all other authors writing for nearly 2,000 years afterwards have held themselves accountable.
One of the another thing that I wanted to talk about in your article was, and you correct me if I have this wrong, is that a point that you seem to come back to is that in embracing active Latin in this way, that the ultimate point is that it brings you back to the text, and that if you can think in the language, if you can communicate orally, you develop the listening skills of the languages, it's only going to make your grasp and understanding of the literary works that much easier. And it reminded me of one of the critiques I've heard, and critiques of my own long ago when I used to teach Latin, is students coming in from high school and saying, "Well, we didn't do that much Latin. We did lots of toga parties and this kind of thing. And if we learned speaking some Latin, it was about asking where the bathroom was and having some kind of fun with the spoken language. But it was always kind of the speaking of Latin was kind of thought to be, this is for fun." Learning how to say hello and basic exchanges was all well and good, but it was always just kind of ancillary to open up your Wheelock text. And so, do I have that right when you say that ultimately, what's the ultimate goal of communicating in Latin? In the context of a classroom, it's to bring you back to the text.
And if I can piggyback on that,
yeah,
because we do a lot of piggybacking here in the Vomitorium.
Yes.
Bring you back to the text with more capability for comprehension and appreciation.
Yes, of course.
That was assumed in what you're saying. You wouldn't want to come back to the text with less, right?
Right. So, having written this mostly almost 10 years ago, I have to admit that my view has changed on some of that issue. My views have changed insofar as I was really sure why you should speak Latin 10 years ago. And I thought that the reason to speak Latin was because it improved one's ability to read the classics. Now, I still believe that one of the best ways, and perhaps the best way, to become better at reading the classics is to use Latin in an active mode and to read or learn to read the classics without an intermediary language. I certainly do believe that. But I've come to understand that there can be other good reasons to speak Latin. And if it takes a toga party or a pizza party or a chariot race or a Latin conversation day during the week for a high school program to have a successful and vibrant Latin curriculum, or for a elementary school Latin program to exist at all, then I'm on board, because there can be a plurality of goods gotten out of speaking Latin. I would add that even if speaking Latin doesn't serve those ends, that is, even if it doesn't enliven and invigorate a Latin curriculum in a primary or secondary school, even if the instructor or the student just finds it fun, just finds it delightful to express themselves from time to time, maybe it's just a salve here and there or a wale at the end of a conversation, I don't object to that, and I encourage it, because every step closer to an engagement in the language is ultimately in the right direction.
Yeah.
Speaking of heading in the right direction, Jeff.
Yes.
It's time for the ads.
This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by the good folks at Hackett Publishing. We love these guys. They've been with us from the beginning. They are one of these companies that is keeping the flame alive. They offer a wide selection of textbooks across academic fields, most notably, I would say, for their classical selections. I've got an upcoming semester.
You do, yeah.
That's around the corner, and I've got a few titles from Hackett that are going to be on the syllabi. I'm excited. And I'm excited for my students because, one, it's the translations are great, and two, they're extremely affordable.
High quality stuff, but it's not going to break the bank.
No.
The kids can buy the books and still get the coffee or the bagel or something like that.
Yeah.
They don't have to choose between eating and owning the texts for the course. Am I right?
It's true. I will often get emails from the students saying, do I really need to buy this book? Because apparently they've had classes where the professor never uses the book.
That's a shame.
And then I say, yes, I'm requiring you to buy this book, but look, you can get this copy of Stanley Lombardo's Odyssey, published by Hackett, for $8.
Yeah, it won't break the bank.
And they'll say, I can do that.
And I'm having a little bit of a prophetic moment here, or we already recorded a part of this episode and are going back to do the ads. I'm not sure which. I think later on, Dr. Patrick Owens is going to mention the Lingua Latina per se Illustrata book, which Hackett publishes.
Yes, I feel that coming as well.
You feel that coming?
I do.
So we're both enthusiasts today.
Yes.
So, listener, if you want to support our little podcast, and if you want to light a match in the dark, light a candle instead of cursing the darkness, go to hackettpublishing.com, HACKETT, and do what, Jeff?
They go to check out their huge selection, find the text that you want, put in this coupon code for the big savings, AN2024. And that will get you two wonderful things that will get you 20% off your entire order and free shipping.
Check it out. This episode of Ad Nauseam is also brought to you by one Mark Helweg and his coffee enterprise, namely ratiocoffee.com. Now, about a decade ago, when Mark moved out of selling coffee and roasted products exclusively, Clive Coffee, and into the development and sale of brilliant coffee machines, he named it Ratio. Not even knowing, I don't think, Ratio is a Latin word. Maybe he knew that. But that at one point he was going to be sponsoring this podcast.
Yeah.
So we call that serendipity, right?
Yes, indeed. Exactly.
So, Jeff, did you have any coffee recently? Have you been drinking some coffee recently?
Every morning, right? And one of the drawbacks of my vacation is that every morning I had coffee, but it was from one of those, Drake and Bleecker, machines.
Senior coffee.
Right. And so it was hard to get the day going.
Did you get any marsupods, any Keurigs?
No, thankfully, no.
Right.
But coming back home,
Yeah.
one of the great things about coming home was coming back to my ratio 8.
Yeah.
And this morning and the last few mornings, I've had that perfect pot of coffee.
Sweet.
With the touch of the button, bloom, brew, ready, that's it.
And then you're ready.
Yep.
So you mean there's no elaborate process of flipping a dial, calibrating, doing anything like that?
No, nothing like that.
Multiple buttons. It's not like a Control-Alt-Delete kind of thing and then go through your task list?
Nothing like that. On vacation, I felt bad for my in-laws. They like to sleep in. I get up early. So I start the coffee, and by the time they get up, that coffee's been roasting on that pad for a couple of
Scorch
hours.
pad.
It's horrible, but you don't have that with a ratio.
No, because you got the hulking flag on.
Hulk and flagon, which will keep it warm naturally for hours on end.
No Kindle brick.
Nope.
Well, I really enjoy my coffee too, and recently received a nice little gift of some beans from family members. A delicious roast. Had it this morning. Ground them up in my Barazza grinder, set it at 21, and then right into my ratio 8.
Fantastic.
Beautiful.
Excellent. So listeners, hey, do yourself a favor. Go to ratiocoffee.com and check out one of these machines. You got the 8, there's the 6, coming soon, the ratio 4.
We're getting close, aren't we?
Getting close. Excited to kind of give you the details on that soon. Find the machine that you want, and if you type in this coupon code, ANCOP8,
Yes.
David, what will that get them?
It'll get them 15% off, and I believe the P stands for precocious.
Precocious.
Yes,
Excellent.
because if you go ahead and get this coffee maker, people are going to say, wow, you're really precocious about your coffee production and consumption, aren't you?
Indeed.
And you can glory in your preciosity.
Yes, so ratiocoffee.com, check it out. All right, Patrick, as we get back into it, did you have some final thoughts on what we were talking about just before the break?
Right. Yes. So active Latin, speaking Latin, so to speak, is a wonderful and effective way to get closer to the text. And that, I think, is the primary advantage. It certainly is the primary advantage and reason why I bring it into my classrooms and why I think it deserves a place in our university and college classrooms. There are certainly other undeniable good reasons to speak Latin in a classroom or outside of class. And I think my mind has broadened since 2016 on that question.
That's good. Yeah. That's what we do here at Ad Nauseam typically, isn't it, Jeff? We broaden minds.
We try to.
That's what we're all about. So if you were to write this same article today, Barbarisms at the Gates, an analysis of some perils in active Latin pedagogy, if you were to write it today, what would you do differently? I mean, you used some interesting examples of some howlers like mox and so forth. Would you use different examples? Do you still have your finger on the pulse of active Latin pedagogy? I know COVID interrupted many of the bidua and conventicula that take place. But just a general question, what might you do differently were you to rewrite it? That's
a good question. I think the issues addressed in the article have changed substantially. I hope that much of the article is still relevant. I think it is. But the landscape is totally different today. I have the impression that active Latin pedagogy has been adopted more broadly in classrooms at every level in the U.S. The resources for speaking Latin are truly myriad. That was not the case just 10 years ago. And I see more and more Latin lovers and serious scholars coexist in spoken Latin groups or societies and reading groups in which at times participants may or may not speak Latin. And so because the landscape is so different today, I would do a lot different. I would choose my examples more judiciously. And by that, I mean, I regret choosing examples from people who were still active in the community. While I didn't always name names, I used examples that were easily recognizable to a certain subset of my audience.
So what you're saying is you alienated some friends?
I did alienate some friends.
Oops.
And probably that was imprudent, and I was a much younger scholar then. So that's something I would do differently. And then I focused really on vocabulary in the article, and I don't think that's so interesting anymore. I love to study neologisms and the use of Latin diction at all periods, but what really fascinates me now is syntax, how syntax shifts in the mouth of the active Latin practitioner when compared with the texts that we have from the classical, medieval, and Renaissance periods. How different is Latin among our contemporaries from that which we find in our written monuments?
So if Patrick, if I can just introduce an example here to try to illustrate what you are saying about syntax, would that be okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. So you and I have discussed the proper way to express the notion of coffee, the common beverage, Potio Arabica, right?
I'm familiar with it.
Yes, and I think you've said it is to be pronounced as kafeya, right, as a first declension noun. So if you wanted to say, I like coffee, there are maybe a half a dozen acceptable ways to put that in terms of vocabulary and syntax. But there are some that are better in terms of ancient syntax than others, right? So you could say something like, cafea me delectat, I like coffee. You could say cafea mihi, or even me placet, if you use either of the dative cases. You could say something like cafea, right? You could use a passive, right? It's something that is liked by me. I don't know how you'd say that, but
cafea delector.
Cafea delector, right? With an ablative there of instrument, right?
That's right.
So as you hear different people using active Latin pedagogy at conventicula and bidua around the country, what are these syntax shifts and permutations that you see, and how do we argue for some being superior to others?
Exempla tua me multum iuvant. I really like your examples. What I have in mind really is the use of, say, subordinate clauses and word order. We learn often in our textbooks, and even in the best of textbooks, we are primed to expect subject, object, verb, word order.
Right.
But now we have a really good sense, thanks to the analysis that computers can provide, that really only accounts for roughly 35% of constructions in Latin. And so if we give it the pride of place in spoken Latin, we probably are missing something. What is lost in word order from the classical period that we are not practicing in our modern conversations? And one might say, well, it doesn't matter. People are still understanding me, right? And that is always the trap. Speaking Latin, if it has as its goal to better understand ancient texts, can't be judged simply on how well our contemporary audience is understanding the communicated message, but ought to be judged as to how well a Roman of the classical period would have understood the message as conveyed. Mutatis mutandis, right? If we're talking about very modern concepts, or we're talking about, say, religious concepts that a Roman would never have understood, we can maybe make exceptions for those. But when I talk about looking at the syntax, that's primarily what I'm interested in at currently.
So that 35% subject, object, verb, the additional 65%, though, is shared between any number of other syntaxes. Is that right?
That's correct.
So you could still argue that it is the majority, in the same way that Abraham Lincoln became president with only 38% of the vote. Not even a simple majority, but outweighed all of the competitors. And so we still have to teach that, don't we? Subject, object, verb, but be sensitive, I understand you to say, to the many other ways in which a syntax can be constructed, including the tendency for the verb esse, the copulative, to be either right near the front of the sentence or roughly in the center between subject and predicate. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right, yes. And so much like an election where someone with a plurality still wins the seat, the winner of such an election ought to take into account the voices of those who did not vote for the candidate, and what that means. If that analogy holds, what I mean to say is, just because it is perhaps the plurality doesn't mean that we can be dogmatic about it, or that we can ignore the meaning behind other word orders.
Right. So here's an example, perhaps the most famous Latin sentence of all time, quus quotandem abutere Catalina patientia nostra, right? Abutere is in roughly the center of that sentence, right? And then what do we have near the end? A vocative and then an ablative, patientia nostra. So doesn't follow subject-object-verb syntax.
That's exactly right. And for that reason, the sentence is particularly dynamic.
Right.
That's excellent. Hey, Patrick, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you in your article, you have some critique of different groups, different people coming up with Neo-Latin words. And I think you used the example of coming up with the word for the photocopier. And amongst in your critique, you write about how many times when people come up with these Neo-Latin terms, they're mixing Greek and Latin roots, and they're doing this in a way that the Romans wouldn't have done, and so it's lazy, and it's not really rooted in antiquity. I wonder if you could. I remember a student gave me a copy of the first Harry Potter book in Latin. And I don't remember what the word was, but I think on the first page there, they had to come up with a Neo-Latin word for the vacuum cleaner. So I'm wondering if you were, you don't have to pick the vacuum cleaner, but if you could walk us through, what would your process be when if you were to come up with a Neo-Latin word for some piece of modern technology, how would you go about doing that? Where would you start? And how would you kind of root that in ancient Latin and keep it true to what the Romans were doing hundreds of years ago?
And I've been in his home, Jeff.
Yes.
Let me tell you, he knows what a vacuum cleaner is. That place is spotless. That's correct. You could parse verbs off the floor.
Nice.
Yes. We know where the hauritorium pulveris is in our house. Yeah, and that just happens to be maybe my preferred term for a vacuum cleaner, and maybe there are other viable alternatives. To your question, which is a good one, Jeff, my first step, if I need to articulate a modern item, is to look at what great Latinists have said about that term. So I would consult lexica. There are lexica for modern terms, and I would make sure that this item has not been well established by a writer, which very frequently happens. The amount of Latinity written in the Renaissance is absolutely incredible, and there is even a wealth of modern Latinity that goes neglected. And so I like to look and first make sure that someone hasn't articulated this in a Latinate manner before, so that I'm not reinventing the wheel. Mm-hmm. If in fact it's not been said before, the next steps would be really to break down what is trying to be said. Can it be said clearly and in a manner that is elegant, using a circumlocution? So hauritorium pulveris is a good example, really, because vacuum cleaner is I think usually written as one word in English, and in Latin we convey that as the sucking mechanism, or the machine sucker of dust.
Yes,
the machine sucker of dust. So we go to the verb root that we're really familiar with, haurio, haurire, fourth conjugation verb there that means to draw, to suck, to bail. And we go to the suffix that makes it into an instrument, which is orium. And then we couple with it the genitive object from pulveris. And it's amazing how frequently we can do that effectively. And when I say effectively, I mean in a way that our audience will understand us while maintaining the basic necessary structures of the Latin language.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. So the Roomba in my home is named Harry, as you know, because it's hauritorium pulveris. But what I would like you to articulate for us, Patrick, if you can, because there are hopefully many Latin teachers listening to this, why is hauritorium pulveris superior, in your in your lights, superior to calling it something made up like vacuumus cleanerus, as some people tend to do? Why is that superior?
Yeah, that's a good question. The thing is, if I write Hauratorium Pulveris in context in a letter or an email to another Latin reader, let's say I were to write that to either one of you, if you had not previously encountered the term, in context, it would still be clear to you what the Hauratorium Pulveris was. And so there's no reason for me to take flight to using the vernacular, which is really what we're doing if we say vacuumus cleanerus. And by adopting terms like vacuumus cleanerus, or as once was the term in my own household, donutum, for donut, if you just admit donutum or vacuumus cleanerus here and there, it's probably not the end of the cohesion of the language. But that creates a tendency. It creates a tendency of sort of laziness. Whenever you don't know the word and it's not on the tip of your tongue, you just say it in another language. And we can see that as the demise of certain Latin-speaking communities. And I'll be very specific here. That, I believe, is the downfall of Latin speaking at the Vatican. Latin speakers at the Vatican very frequently admitted Italian into their speech, and ultimately their Latin became Latin Italianese. And
Jeff, we're going to get a lot of heat for this,
Exactly.
All those people at the Vatican who listen to ad nauseum.
And ultimately now you can wander the halls of the Vatican and hear no Latin whatsoever, because it was a gradual demise of Latin, even at the Vatican.
So a donut is capetium, is that right?
That's very good. Yeah, capetium is a fine usage there. We tend to say sphera, which is an ancient dessert that was sold on a stick.
Okay.
Yeah.
I looked up the German word for vacuum cleaner. I'm probably not going to pronounce it correctly. Staubsauger. And so another argument you could make is that if you were writing to an English speaker like Jeff and I, and you used vacuumus cleanerus, then we could recognize it because we move in the language from which you borrowed that vernacular. But if you were writing to Wilfred Stroh or some other German friend who maybe didn't know vacuum cleaner as an English word, right? They would be closed out from that borrowing in a way they wouldn't be if you were just working from Latin. Do you think that's a valid argument?
That's exactly right. And while Wilfred Stroh certainly does know the English word vacuum cleaner, you would relegate your audience to only those who shared in your native language community. And that's not what we want to do. It's not a good practice to eliminate possible audience members from your writing. And as I said, it builds a certain laziness that then builds on itself. And ultimately, the desire to remain in Latin is enervated.
That's great. This reminds me of one of my favorite anecdotes from my own teaching history. Is you mentioned in your article about kind of the danger of using some of these online dictionaries, and if you're not versed in particular Britishisms, it might lead you down the wrong path. And I gave an extra credit assignment at the end of a Latin course where I said students could come in. They could translate, verse and chorus of their favorite song, but they could only get the extra credit if they performed it. And I had a few takers, and one of my male students, his song that he chose was "Rocket Man" by Elton John, and so he needed a Latin word for a rocket, and he went to, I think it was William Whitaker's Words, and he typed in "rocket," and it gave him back a "rucetta," a Neo-Latin, but not realizing that "rocket" as a Britishism means arugula. And so he's saying "We're Rucetta," he's saying "Arugula Man" to the class. And it was fantastic.
Well, that's a great assignment.
You failed him, right, Jeff? You failed him.
I failed him. Yes,
failed him
exactly.
twice.
I shouted him out of the room.
Good,
so.
good.
What a terrific learning experience. That student and all the other students who witnessed Arugula Man will never forget that lesson.
I think you're right.
You can't simply plug into a dictionary a one-for-one expectation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, as we get closer to winding up this episode, perhaps my last question for you, Patrick, maybe not my last complaint, and that is, what advice would you give to those just beginning to adopt active Latin pedagogy? And I ask that advisedly because maybe the audience doesn't know this, maybe they do, maybe they know and don't care, but Patrick is one of the best active Latin practitioners, in my studied opinion, in the world. He's phenomenally good at speaking Latin, no doubt because he studied with some of the greats like Thunberg, Luigi Moralia, and others. So what would you say, Patrick, to those who want to try some active Latin pedagogy, but it's completely uncharted territory for them?
Well, David, that's a very kind introduction to your question. I'm not sure that it's merited at all, but
it is.
Here it goes. Things have changed, as I outlined earlier, in the intervening years. And today, there are so many resources and so many possibilities for someone who is interested in beginning active Latin pedagogy or learning to speak Latin at all. First and foremost, I recommend that someone who wants to learn Latin pick up a copy of Lingua Latina per se illustrata, or also known as Familia Romana, a series that has been reinvigorated by Hackett Publishing. Check out Latin Per Diem, which is a fantastic site run by David.
I've heard of this.
Which has daily
Sounds
Latin
vaguely
lessons.
familiar.
Yes. Then there's the Paideia Institute for the Humanities has something called Tela Paideia, where you can take courses online in spoken Latin and even Greek. There's the Veterum Sapientia Institute, which focuses on religious or Catholic Latin learning, but it's really for everybody. For younger learners or for parents of younger students and educators in the elementary school level, Laura Eid of the University of Dallas has developed a new program, a K-12 Latin program that's worth a careful consideration. And I would say that the Paideia Institute, again, has come out with an entirely online introduction to Latin for elementary and high school students. So there are just so many resources that are worthwhile and available. If people already know Latin and they want to speak Latin, there are Discords, which is a website where people can speak to one another readily. Then there are research guides. Second language acquisition has finally been accepted by classicists as a field that's worthy of study and consideration. So second language acquisition theory has moved in the modern languages finally, I think, past Krashen. And so the second language acquisition theory post-Krashen is now finally making its way to classical languages. And so there are a number of books that are available and can be easily found, like Cambridge Studies in Second Language Acquisition or Current Approaches in Second Language Acquisition. So those would all be good places to start.
Excellent. Hey, yeah, I have a number of questions, Patrick, that I would love to ask you. We're up against the clock, but I think ending on a jumping off point, giving students a place to kind of to go next, I think is a perfect way to close this out.
Yes, and to add in also, if I may, the first 1,000 words in Latin by Usborne, the Find the Duck book, right? We've talked about that before on the program, and Patrick was the main scholar behind all of the words that you can find in that book. Fantastic resource. And Patrick, I'm going to see you in Waco, Texas, correct? In October.
I look forward to it.
Where we will be leading together a biduum where I'll be learning and you'll be teaching. And maybe if the students can endure it, I'll do a little teaching as well. So thank you so much for
I hope
being
that
on the program.
I hope that some of your audience members will join us.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you both. It's a joy to be with you.
Bye-bye.
Valete.
Well, Jeff, that wraps it up. I think we have to get out of here, don't we?
I hear something going on up the door at the top of the stairs.
Yeah, it's a little frightening. I hear
terrifying.
Like claws and hooves and bleating. What is that?
Well, I think my guess is that I hate to say it, it's the chupacabra.
The chupacabra.
Yes, the goat sucker.
That's something I ordered at Taco Bell last week.
Man, you got the
what's a chupacabra?
It's a goat sucker.
Really?
Yes, it's some kind of folkloric horrible beast from south of the border.
What's he doing here?
I don't know. What is he doing? Do you have any idea what is he's upset about something, right?
Okay. Maybe he's upset because he was left out of episode 135.
Were we supposed to talk about the chupacabra?
I think so. But you remember 135? We
Yeah.
were talking about portents and monsters.
That's
and
right.
There was the Sasquatch.
Yes.
Remember that hairy creature with the Swiss the Swiss
timepiece?
Yeah.
Right.
And the abdominal snowman.
Exactly.
Just one crunch after another.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Oh, and also the already but not yeti.
Ah, yes.
That guy.
So Chupacabra is angry and he wants to get in here. So I guess we better vacate the vomitorium and let him have it.
Exactly. Well, I've learned my lesson.
Okay.
Right. But before we do, Dave, tell us a little bit about. It's fortuitous that this.
Yes, it is.
That this episode was about active Latin.
Yeah. Who saw this coming?
Right. But tell us a bit about some of your own programs.
Okay. So LLPSI, Latin Lingua Latina per se illustrata, which I like to translate as Latin teaches itself.
Yep.
Isn't that idiomatic?
Perfect.
Okay. Hans Orberg wrote this textbook, Familia Romana, and it begins with these kinds of words, Roma in Italia est. If you want to study Latin from the ground up, ab initio, go to my site, latinperdiem.com/LLPSI. Check out the program. I'm going to be running a flash sale.
All right. What?
Not a flash flood, but just a flash sale.
Give us the details.
Well, it's going to be on Wednesday, August 7. For one day, you can get 17% off any of my online courses.
Excellent.
Now, you may be asking, why 17%?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
It's very specific. Why 17? Why not 15 or 20?
I just thought 17 was a good number.
Okay, all right.
It's prime, isn't it?
It is a prime number.
It's going to be my own prime day.
There we go.
All right. You can get 17% off any of our online courses, a one-day flash sale. That will be for the Latin if you want to get started. If you're a little more advanced, you want to take one of the classes that I have recorded on Cicero or John Calvin or Theodore Beza, a number of courses, you can get one of those. It's quite an inexpensive option, actually, and it's going to be 17% off the sticker price. If you're interested in Greek, then you want to check out Moss Method. So that's mossmethod.com. This program will take you from
neophyte to erudite.
Sounds like you've had some practice with that, Winkle.
I got it down.
All right. And what is this? Well, if you want to learn Greek, you want to profit from the last 30 years or so. What are we on now? 32 years of study.
Wow.
I've been studying Greek a long time. I should know more, frankly, after all that time. And teaching it for a long time, too. And I've compressed all that knowledge into this course. And there are other programs out there. Some of them may be better. I'm not really qualified to say, but very confident you won't find a better value.
Yes.
That is the combination of expertise and affordability. Mossmethod.com. Check out many of the free resources on my YouTube channel and maybe sign up for the class.
Sounds great. Hey, and we have people to thank as always. Mishka, our great engineer, cleans this up, gets it turned around in record time. We love the work that she does.
Amazing. So thankful for it.
Scott Van Zen, Ken Tamplin, these great musicians who have so generously allowed us to use their incredible music that you hear at the beginning and as the bumper music throughout.
That's right.
Love these guys.
Yeah, for the ads and so forth. I hope, I could be totally wrong here, but Jeff, our hope is that the listener likes the little bit of incongruity between these dry, abstruse topics and the catchy music, that comes at the beginning and at the end. It's incongruity, right?
But it's that tension that makes it interesting.
That's right. Keeps life interesting. So thank you, Scott and Ken. You can check out their guitar playing and singing courses online. Jeff, what if they want to get in touch with you?
It's very easy.
The listeners.
They can write to me at jeff@adnauseam.com. Don't forget that V. And if they want to write to you, Dave?
It's Dave at we're doing this opposite.
Yes, we are.
Dave at adnauseam.com. Don't forget the V in nauseum. And we will respond to your criticisms. We will respond to your praise, obviously. Mm-hmm. And if they want to get a T-shirt like the one you're wearing, a Quai Nocent Docent.
That's right. Got it on right now. Yep. Go to adnauseam.com. Again, don't forget the V. Check out the Lurchwood merch section, and yes, be the first on your block.
Yeah,
to be fashionable,
like your neighbor, the young man. What's his name?
My neighbor,
the young guy with the John Wayne accent.
What are you talking? Oh, oh, he's since moved away.
Oh, he has?
Sorry. So Fulton.
Fulton
is now.
Well, I found another place to live.
But I'm wondering if your son could come out to play.
That's Fulton. He's first on his block. So next week is going to be episode 157.
Yep.
Where are we headed?
I think we're still kind of. Are we TBD?
We're stuck between Maru and Carl Richard.
Right, and we've kind of got that loose summer schedule right now.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
We'll keep it real.
Yep. And Dave, I believe you. I'm looking at this. I love this.
Yeah.
You have the gustatory parting shot.
I do, and this is from a woman named Amy Bender.
Mm-hmm.
I like the name. I've never heard of her before. The name of the work is The Color Master: Stories.
All right.
And before I say it, I have to give a little bit of a background.
Okay.
But for the quote. So I have been a longtime apple eater. Mm-hmm. I love eating apples. You have a favorite variety?
I like the Honey Crisp.
Honey Crisp.
Yes.
It's hard to beat that. That's a money apple. I'm a big fan of the Granny Smith.
I always like those too. Yeah.
Because they're so firm, and there's a good contrast between the tartness and the sweetness.
Indeed.
Now, for many, many, many years, like 30, I would eat one apple a day.
Oh.
According to the doctor's dictum.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
What would that be in Latin? Well, never mind.
Yeah.
And I had heard early on that apple seeds have cyanide. Do you know this?
I think I have heard
Trace
that.
amounts of cyanide.
Yes, right.
So I would always eat the entire apple.
Yes.
Core and seeds.
Right. Trying to poison yourself?
No, my thinking was if ever anyone wants to poison me,
you built up a
they
tolerance.
won't succeed because I've been ingesting tiny bits of cyanide for years. But I recently learned that it only takes about 40 seeds to be lethal.
Goodness.
About 40 seeds in one sitting.
Man.
So that's only about, 3 apples?
Yeah.
So that scared me away.
Oh, gotcha. So no more seeds.
Actually, I haven't eaten an apple in quite a long time now.
Oh, man.
So on to the quote.
Yes.
Miss Bender says, quote, "It's unsettling to meet people who don't eat apples." What do you think, Jeff?
I agree with her.
You're unsettled?
I do, yes.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.